It is not a statement, nor fact, nor is it meant to harm, defame, or misrepresent any brand or company. This guy out there, Mat Armstrong, that wants to come and fix the vehicle, but we need to make sure that we could preserve the brand.
Everyone assumed engineers only left Bugatti for Ferrari, McLaren, or Formula One. Nobody expected one of Bugatti's top minds to join YouTuber Mat Armstrong instead. That decision immediately sparked questions across the automotive world. But the biggest surprise wasn't where he went. It was what he started revealing about Bugatti's engineering, testing, hidden challenges, and the reality behind some of the world's most expensive hypercars. The car that refused to die. If you have spent any time around car videos in the last few months, you already sense that something strange has been circling Bugatti. And this spring it finally reached a boiling point. The crashed Chiron that everyone swore was finished, the one Bugatti itself had written off as a dead machine, roared back to life in a workshop far from any official factory. Mat Armstrong and the small crew around him managed to fire up that giant engine after countless people online had promised it would never turn over again. I still remember watching that moment ripple across social media and feeling like a line had just been crossed that a brand this powerful was never supposed to allow. Then the story grew far beyond the car itself, and this is the part most people completely missed. In the spring of 2026, Porsche made the decision to sell off its entire share of Bugatti Rimac and step away from the whole arrangement. A group of international investors moved in to take that stake, and just like that, the long marriage between the Volkswagen empire and Bugatti Ferrari was quietly ending. For nearly 3 decades, that German giant had stood behind the brand, and now it was walking out the door at the exact moment a builder from England was making global headlines by reviving one of its cars without any permission at all. You have to understand how rare that timing really is. The company at the heart of the storm was changing hands at the very top, while a tiny team in a private workshop was proving that the impossible could be done. Mate Rimac, the man now steering Bugatti, had spent the previous months locked in a very public argument over whether any of this should be happening. Strangely, though, his tone had begun to soften in a way that made a lot of us lean closer to the screen and wonder what was really going on behind those factory walls. To understand why grown adults were arguing about this car in comment sections late into the night, you first have to rewind to the moment the internet realized what was quietly being attempted. The clip that went viral. There is a certain kind of video that stops your thumb mid-scroll, and this was one of them. Word got out that a wrecked Bugatti Chiron, a car carrying a price tag most people will never see in a lifetime, was sitting in a private workshop while a self-taught mechanic from Leicester planned to bring it back from the dead. The car itself was no ordinary Bugatti either. It was a Persport, one of only around 60 ever built, which meant every single panel on it was rarer than gold and nearly impossible to replace. What truly made people lose their minds was not the crash itself, but what Bugatti chose to do next. The company reached into its own system and locked the car's identity number, which in plain terms meant that no dealership anywhere on the planet was allowed to sell parts for that specific machine. The car had been branded, blacklisted, and treated like something that was supposed to quietly disappear. The moment that news spread, the story stopped being about a broken supercar and became about something much bigger that ordinary people actually care about. The story behind Mat only made it more gripping. This was a man with millions of subscribers who had built his entire name buying broken machines nobody wanted and turning them into something whole again. He had done it with a Rolls-Royce that once belonged to a famous footballer and with cars that had smashed straight into houses. But everyone watching understood that a Bugatti was a completely different animal and that the brand had absolutely no intention of letting him win. What almost nobody saw coming was that the fight was about to get personal, because the most powerful man in the entire company was about to step out of the shadows and answer him directly. When the boss picked up the camera. Normally, when a small creator pokes at a giant company, the giant stays silent and lets its lawyers do the talking. That is not what happened here, and that is exactly why this story kept climbing. Mate Rimac, the man who now runs Bugatti, did something almost unheard of for someone in his position. He picked up his phone, recorded himself, and spoke straight to the millions of people following the drama. He looked into the lens and said that a lot of what people were hearing about Bugatti's service and repair costs was simply not true. And with that one move, he turned a YouTube saga into a public standoff between a billion-dollar brand and a man in a workshop. His main argument was never really about money, even though the money involved was staggering. It was about safety, and he made his case in a way that stuck with people. He talked about testing a Bugatti in brutal cold, somewhere around -20 degrees, and discovering that the leather on the dashboard grew so stiff that it could actually interfere with the airbags firing the way they were designed to. That single detail did more work than any spec sheet ever could, because it planted a real fear in your chest. If a change that small could turn a safety system into a danger, then something rebuilt outside the factory suddenly felt like a gamble with a person's life. Rimac also pushed back hard on the wild repair figures floating around online. Where some people claimed a headlight alone cost enough to buy a house, he insisted the real numbers were only a fraction of that. He was trying to drag the whole conversation back down to reality, and to remind everyone that only a tiny handful of trained people in the entire world even know how to separate certain parts of these cars safely. In his own words, supporting a backyard rebuild simply was not the right thing to do, no matter how much he respected the effort behind it. For a while, it looked like an honest disagreement between two proud men who each believed they were completely right. One of them stood for the freedom to fix what you own. The other stood for the safety of a machine that can move faster than most planes at the moment they leave the ground. But the deeper Matt got into the build, the more he began to notice something that did not sit right with him. A feeling that the company speaking to him in public was not entirely united behind the scenes. The voice behind the curtain. This is the moment the story turns from a loud public fight into something quieter and, honestly, a little more unsettling. As the months rolled on, the tone coming out of Bugatti slowly started to change. What began as a firm and total no gradually bent into something softer. At first, the company would not sell a single bolt for that car. Then, somewhere along the way, the blacklist that had frozen the car out of every parts department in the world was quietly lifted, and a factory repair that had once been quoted at a fortune was suddenly being offered at a far smaller number. Matt noticed the shift, and he was honest about how strange it felt to him. He said out loud that he did not believe the change was coming from Rimac alone. He got the sense that there was someone else standing behind the words he was hearing, that the messages reaching him were being shaped by people whose names he would never learn. It is the kind of thing that makes your skin prickle a little. The idea that decisions about your own project are being made by voices in a room you are not even allowed to enter. Matt simply said the tone had changed and that he found it strange. And then he let the audience draw their own conclusions from there. That honesty is a big part of why so many people trusted him over a company with an entire marketing department at its disposal. When a giant speaks in a polished, careful voice, and a normal guy speaks like your mate across the pub, most of us know deep down who we are naturally inclined to believe. While all of that quiet back and forth played out in emails and interviews, the thing that truly stunned people was not being decided in any boardroom at all. It was taking shape on a workshop floor, one impossible part at a time, in ways the factory swore could never actually be done. The backyard miracle. This is the stretch that still gives me chills, because it is where a small team did what a company worth billions swore could not be done. Without factory parts, and without any blessing from Bugatti's home in France, Matt and the people around him started solving problems that would have made most professional shops turn around and walk away. The airbags the car desperately needed were sourced in the most unlikely way, pulled from a humble Audi, the kind of ordinary car you might see in any supermarket car park, and then adapted to fit a hypercar. The part numbers were close enough to work, even if the factory would never admit that in 100 years. Then there were the radiators, and this is where it becomes almost unbelievable. A Chiron carries a small army of them tucked all around the body to keep that monster engine from cooking itself, and replacing them the official way was completely off the table. So the team built them by hand, from scratch, fabricating cooling parts for one of the most complex engines ever made inside a private workshop. When that car finally started and the temperatures held perfectly steady, it was living proof that the knowledge locked away inside Bugatti was not nearly as untouchable as the world had been led to believe. One of the most telling moments of all came from a broken transmission mount. On these cars, that mount is actually designed to shatter during a crash on purpose, as part of a clever safety system. Rather than beg for a replacement that was never going to come, the team simply welded the original back together and carried on. They even had to work out the exact tightness for certain bolts by pausing Bugatti's own factory videos on the screen and studying them frame by frame, reading the numbers straight off the company that had refused to help them. There is something deeply human about every piece of this, and I think that is why it hit people so hard. It is the story of ordinary determination beating expensive secrecy. It is a reminder that behind every wall of intimidating branding, a car is still just a machine, and machines can be understood by people who care enough to try. Every homemade radiator and every welded bracket was a quiet answer to a company that had spent years telling owners they were helpless without its permission. That is exactly what pushed this whole saga past the borders of the car world and into a much larger argument that has been quietly boiling for years. An argument about who truly holds power over the things we believe we own. Who really owns your car? Strip away the Bugatti badge and the millions of dollars, and what you are left with is a question that touches nearly everyone watching. When you buy something, do you actually own it? Or are you simply renting the right to use it under the maker's rules? This saga became a symbol for that exact fight, the one people often call the right to repair. Farmers have battled over it with their tractors. Phone owners have battled over it with sealed batteries. And now a wrecked hypercar had somehow become the loudest example of them all. Because if a man could be told he was not allowed to fix a car he legally owned, then the same idea touched every single one of us. What makes it even richer is the story of the man defending Bugatti's side. Mate Rimac did not come from old money or a family empire. He started out as a young man in a garage, taking an old worn-out car and turning it into a record-breaking electric machine with his own 2 hands. He was, in every real sense, a backyard builder who clawed his way all the way to the top. So there was a strange kind of poetry in watching him, of all people, tell another self-made builder that some things should be left to the factory. They were 2 versions of the very same dream, and yet they stood on opposite sides of the same fence. Meanwhile, the ground under Bugatti kept shifting beneath everyone's feet. The famous engine at the very heart of this whole story, that enormous 16-cylinder monster with 4 turbochargers, was already being retired. Its replacement had arrived in a brand new car with a completely different heart, closing the book on an era that had defined Bugatti for 2 decades. The car everyone was fighting over was, in a strange way, already turning into a piece of history even as the drama raged on around it. So you had a legendary brand changing owners at the very top, a legendary engine being laid quietly to rest, and a very public war over whether a normal person should ever be allowed near one of these cars with a wrench in his hand. Every single thread of this story was pulling in a different direction, and yet somehow they all tied back to that one crashed Sport sitting in a workshop far away from France. But underneath every headline and every heated comment sat one claim that had pulled millions of curious people in from the very beginning. The claim about a top engineer who had supposedly walked out of Bugatti and started spilling its secrets, and that claim was about to come apart in a way almost nobody expected. The engineer who never existed. Now we come back to the whisper that started all of this, the one you have been holding in the back of your mind this entire time. The idea of a top Bugatti engineer resigning from that guarded factory and joining a YouTuber to expose the brand from the inside is a thrilling one to sit with. It is also, once you actually chase it down, completely untrue. There was no chief engineer who switched sides. There was no insider walking away from polished marble floors to spill forbidden secrets on camera. That entire version of events was made up, and understanding how it was made up tells you a great deal about the world we are all scrolling through every single day. The claim traces back to a small channel pumping out videos with the help of artificial intelligence, the kind of operation that stitches together a dramatic voiceover and a shocking title just to farm clicks from a real story. You can even hear the seams in it if you listen closely, with the robotic narration mangling the car's name and stumbling over the boss's name as though it had never once heard either of them spoken out loud. And when that video finally reveals the mysterious insider it keeps teasing you with, the great Bugatti engineer turns out to be a welder and fabricator known simply as Bob, a genuinely talented craftsman who helped with the build, but who never worked for Bugatti for a single day in his life. The exact same trick had been played before with other brands too. There is a nearly identical video claiming a top Ferrari engineer quit and joined the very same YouTuber, which honestly tells you everything you need to know. It was never real reporting. It was a template, a fill-in-the-blank story with the badges swapped out, designed to make you feel like you had stumbled onto a huge secret so that you would click, watch, and move on before you ever noticed the lie sitting right in front of you. What I find genuinely fascinating, though, is something most people never stop to consider. The truth did not need the lie at all. The real story, the one about a locked car, a defiant builder, a billionaire boss, homemade radiators, and a quiet power struggle inside a famous company, was already far more gripping than any invented defector could ever hope to be. Somebody looked at a saga that was completely true and decided it was not exciting enough, and in doing so, they insulted the very thing that made it special. The people chasing the fake version were reaching for a shadow, while the real story was standing right there in the light the whole time, better than any fiction they could have written. So what do you make of all this? A company that locked away a car it no longer even wanted, and a lie that tried to ride on top of a truth that never needed it in the first place. Drop your honest thoughts down in the comments below, because I genuinely want to know whose side you land on after hearing the full story.